Section 10 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Matilda of Scotland, Chapter 2, Part 2. The year 1109 must have been an era of eventful interest to Matilda. Her royal husband, having spent the winter and spring in Normandy, returned to England in the summer to visit her and their infant family, and kept court with uncommon splendor in his new palace at Windsor, which had been completed in his absence. It was there that he received the ambassadors who came to solicit the hand of Princess Matilda for the Emperor Henry V. The proposal was eagerly accepted by Henry Beauclerc, and the princess, then just turned 5 years old, was solemnly espoused, by proxy, to her royal suitor, who was 40 years her senior. But, on account of her tender age, the infant bride was allowed for the present to remain under the care of the queen her mother. About the same period, Alexander the Fierce of Scotland, Matilda's brother, condescended to wed Isabella, the youngest illegitimate daughter of his sister's husband. His motives for contracting this alliance are difficult to imagine, since the young lady was remarkable for the plainness of her person and the impropriety of her conduct. The fact that Henry's numerous illegitimate children were many of them adults at this period, proves that they were born in his youth, and at all events before his marriage with Matilda of Scotland. In the year 1109, the mighty Norman chief Fitzhamon, lord of Glamorgan, dying without sons, left the Lady Amabel, his young heiress, to the guardianship of the king. Henry, wishing to secure so rich a prize for his eldest natural son Robert, proposed him to his fair ward, as a suitable husband for her. But the haughty Norman damsel, though only 16, intrepidly replied, that the ladies of her house were not accustomed to wed nameless persons. Then the king answered, Neither shalt thou, damsel, for I will give my son a fair name, by which he and his sons shall be called. Robert Fitzroy shall be his name henceforth. But, objected the prudent heiress of Glamorgan, a name so given is nothing. Where are the lands, and what the lordship, of the man you will me to wed, sire? Truly, responded the king with a smile, thy question is a shrewd one, damsel. I will endow my son Robert with the lands and honours of Gloucester, and by that title shall he henceforth be called. The Lady Amabel made no further demur, we are told, but wedded the king's son without delay. The fact was, the king was generously bestowing upon his son Robert the lands and honours which had been granted or sold to Fitzhamon, her deceased father, by William Rufus, once the patrimony of the luckless Britrick Miau, and the young lady, who seems to have been gifted with no ordinary share of worldly wisdom, thought, no doubt, that she had better hold the lands and honours of Gloucester, on the tenure of wife's service to the king's son, than lose them altogether. Such were the dealings of the Anglo-Norman sovereigns with their wards. The high-spirited heiress of Fitzhamon was, however, fortunate in the marriage that was thus arranged for her by her royal guardian. Robert Fitzroy was the princely earl of Gloucester, who so valiantly upheld the title of his half-sister, the Empress Matilda, to the English crown, in the succeeding reign. The following year, an enormous tax of 3 shillings on every hide of land was levied, to pay the portion of the Princess Matilda, by which the sum of £824,000 was raised, and the princess was sent over to her imperial husband with a magnificent retinue. She was espoused to him in the Cathedral of Mentz, and solemnly crowned by the Archbishop of Cologne. Queen Matilda was in the next year left to keep court alone, in consequence of a formidable insurrection in Normandy, in favour of William Clito, son of the unfortunate Robert Courthose, which was privately fomented by the Earl of Flanders. King Henry, perceiving that all classes of his continental subjects were averse to the yoke of an absent sovereign, considered it expedient to forego the society of his queen and their children, for a period of nearly 2 years, while he held his separate state in Normandy. In the year 1112, we find the king and queen were together at Winchester with their court, where they personally assisted at the removal of the bodies of Alfred the Great and his queen Elisabeth from the ruinous chapel of Newminster, close to Winchester Cathedral, to the magnificent Abbey of Hyde, founded and endowed by Henry and Matilda, as a more suitable shrine for the relics of their illustrious progenitor, from whom, be it remembered, Henry, as well as his Saxon queen, was descended in the 8th generation, through the marriage of Elisabeth, the daughter of Alfred, with an Earl of Flanders, his maternal ancestor. Here, too, the bones of Edward the Elder and his queen, the immediate ancestors of Matilda, were at the same time translated. The following year Henry was again in Normandy, where he entered into an amicable treaty with one of his most troublesome enemies, Fulk, Earl of Anjou, by a matrimonial alliance between his heir, Prince William, and Alice, the daughter of that earl. The education of Matilda's eldest daughter being considered as completed in 1114, the marriage was fully solemnized between her and the Emperor Henry V, and they were both crowned a second time, with great pomp, in the cathedral at Mentz. The young empress was then only in her 12th year. Notwithstanding this great disparity in age, it appears that the youthful bride enjoyed a reasonable share of happiness with her mature consort, by whom she was treated with the greatest indulgence, while her great beauty and majestic carriage won the hearts of the German princes, and obtained for her unbounded popularity. Matilda's eldest son, Prince William, or the Atheling, as he was more generally styled by the English, was, in the year 1115, conducted by the king his father with great pomp into Normandy, where he was presented to the states as the heir of the duchy, and fealty was sworn to him by the barons and freemen. This prince was then only 12 years old. He returned with his royal father to England in July, and the following year Henry summoned that memorable parliament mentioned by Holinshed as the first held since the Norman Conquest, to meet at Salisbury, and then appointed the young prince as his successor. William of Malmesbury says, "Every freeman of England and Normandy, of whatsoever degree, or to whatsoever lord his vassal service was due, was made to perform homage, and swear fealty to William, son of King Henry and Queen Matilda." The Easter festival was kept this year by the royal family at Odiham Castle in Hampshire. Matilda passed the Christmas festival in the same year, in the company of her royal husband, at the Abbey of St. Albans. They were the guests of Abbot Richard, who had then brought to a happy conclusion the building of that magnificent fabric. He invited the queen, who was one of its benefactresses, the king, and the Archbishop of Rouen, and many prelates and nobles, to assist at the consecration of the abbey, which took place Christmas Day, 1115. The royal pair, with their suite of nobles and ladies, were lodged in the abbey, and entertained from December 25th to January 6th. The queen, sanctioned by Henry, gave, by charter, 2 manors to St. Albans. The existence of a portrait of Queen Matilda is certainly owing to this visit, for in a rich illuminated volume, called the Golden Book of St. Albans, now in the British Museum, may still be seen a miniature of the royal benefactress. The queen is attired in the royal mantle of scarlet, lined with white fur. It covers the knees and is very long. The mantle is square to the bust. A cordon of scarlet and gold, with a large tassel, passes through 2 gold knobs. She holds the cordon in her left hand. She wears a tight kirtle of dark blue, buttoned down the front with gold. Her sleeves fit close to the arms and are scarlet like the mantle. A white veil is arranged in a square form on the brow, and is surmounted by a gold crown, formed of 3 large trefoils, and gold orelettes appear beneath the veil on each side of the cheeks. The veil flows behind her shoulders with lappets. Matilda is very fair in complexion. She has a long throat and elegant form of tall proportions. She displays with her right hand the charter she gave the abbey, from which hangs a very large red seal, whereon, without doubt, was impressed her effigy in grand relief. She sits on a carved stone bench, on which is a scarlet cushion figured with gold leaves. This cushion is in the form of a wool pack, but has 4 tassels of gold and scarlet. A piece of figured cloth is hung at the back of her seat. There is no armorial bearings, one proof of the authenticity of the portrait. Queen Matilda gave us Belwick and Lilliburn, is the notation appended by the monks of St. Albans to this portrait. About this period, the stately new palace at Woodstock being completed, and the noble park, reckoned the finest at that time in England, having been walled round, Henry stocked it with a curious menagerie of wild beasts, the first zoological collection ever seen in this country. It is described in very quaint terms by Stowe, who says, "The king craved from other kings lions, leopards, lynxes, and camels, and other curious beasts, of which England hath none. Among others, there was a strange animal called a strix, or porcupine, sent him by William of Montpelier, which beast, says the worthy chronicler, is, among the Africans, counted as a kind of hedgehog, covered with pricking bristles, which they shoot out naturally on the dogs that pursue them." Unbounded hospitality was one of the social virtues of this peaceful reign, especially at this peculiar era, when the benignant example of the good queen had, for a period of nearly 17 years, produced the happiest effect in softening the manners of the haughty and powerful Norman families, who were at that time the magnates of the land. The Norman families, at this period, were beginning to practice some of the peaceful pursuits of the Anglo-Saxons, and ladies of high rank considered it no infringement on the dignity of their station to attend to the profitable concerns of the poultry yard and the dairy. The Countess Constance of Chester, though the wife of Hugh Lupus, the king's first cousin, kept a herd of kine, and made good Cheshire cheeses, 3 of which she presented to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Giraldus Cambriensis bears honourable testimony to the excellence of the produce of the cheeseshire in that day. A fresh revolt in Normandy deprived Matilda of the society of her husband and son in 1117. The king, according to Edmer, returned and spent Christmas with her, as she was at that time in a declining state of health, leaving Prince William with his Norman baronage as a pledge for his return. His sojourn was, of necessity, very brief. He was compelled, by the distracted state of affairs in Normandy, to rejoin his army there, and Matilda never saw either her husband or her son again. Resigned and perfect in all the duties of her high calling, the dying queen remained, during this trying season, in her palace at Westminster lonely, though surrounded with all the splendour of royalty, enduring with complacency and patience the separation from her beloved consort and children, and affording, to the last hour of her life, a beautiful example of piety and self-denial. She expired on the 1st of May, 1118, passionately lamented by every class of the people, to whom her virtues and wisdom had rendered her inexpressibly dear. According to the most ancient chroniclers, the king her husband was much afflicted when the intelligence of Matilda's death reached him, amidst the turmoil of battle and siege in Normandy. Piers of Langtoft alludes to the grief felt by the royal widower at the loss of his amiable consort, in terms of the most homely simplicity. Now is the king sorry, for her death doth him grieve. Harding's rhyming chronicle produces the following quaint stanzas on the death of Matilda, and the sorrow of King Henry for her loss. The year of Christ 1000 was full clear, 100 eke and withal 18, when good Queen Maud was dead and laid on bier, at Westminster buried as well was seen, for heaviness of which, the king I ween, to Normandy then went with his son, the Duke William, and there with him did one. Harding is, however, mistaken in supposing that Henry was with his beloved consort at the time of her decease. The same chronicler gives us another stanza on the death of Henry, in which he, in yet more positive terms, speaks of the conjugal affection which united the Norman sovereign to his Saxon queen. Of Christ's date there was 1000 year, 100 also, and 39 mo. Buried at Reading, was well in doth appear, in the abbey which there he founded so. Of monks black, whenever they ride or go. that pray for him and Queen Maud his wife, who either loved withouten strife. The chronicler says, nothing happened to trouble the king, save the death of his queen Matilda, the very mirror of piety, humility, and princely bounty. The same causes that withheld the king from attending Matilda in her dying illness prevented him from honouring her obsequies with his presence. Matilda was buried on St. Philip's Day in Westminster Abbey, on the right side of her royal uncle, Edward the Confessor. Great disputes, however, have existed to the place of her interment, which has been contested with almost as much zeal as was displayed by the 7 cities of Greece, in claiming the honour of having given birth to Homer. The monks of Reading averred that their royal patroness was buried in her own stately abbey there, where her illustrious consort was afterwards interred. The rhyming chroniclers insist that she was buried at St. Paul's Cathedral, and that her epitaph was placed in Westminster Abbey. These are the words of Piers of Langtoft. At London, in St. Paul's, in tomb she is laid. Christ, then, of her soul have mercy. If any one will witten, know of her story, at Westminster it is written readily. That is to say, that it may be plainly read. Tyrrell declares that she was buried at Winchester, but that tablets to her memory were set up in many churches, an honour which she shares with Queen Elizabeth. The following passage from the learned and faithful antiquary, Weaver, expressly indicates that it was his opinion that the mortal remains of Matilda, the good queen, reposed near the relics of her royal uncle, Edward the Confessor, in the solemn temple founded by that last Saxon monarch, and which had been completed under her careful superintendence. Here lieth in Westminster Abbey, without any tomb, Matilda or Maud, daughter of Malcolm Canmore, King of Scots, and wife of Henry I. of England, who brought to him children, William, Richard, and Mary, who perished by shipwreck, and likewise Maud, who was wife to Henry, the 5th Emperor. She died the 1st day of May, 1118. She had an excellent epigram made to her commendation, whereof these 4 verses only remain. Prospera non laetem fecere, non aspera tristem, aspera risus errant, prospera terror errant, non decor efficit fragilem, non spectra superbam, sola potens humilis, sola pudica decens. Henry of Huntington, the chronicler, no mean poet, was the author of these Latin lines. From the numerous translation extant of this beautiful epitaph, we select the following exquisite lines, which come very close to the original, and afford a lovely portrait of the feminine graces of this admirable queen. Success ne'er sat exulting in her eye, nor disappointment caused the frequent sigh. Beauty nor made her vain, nor sceptre proud, nor titles taught to scorn the meaner crowd. Supreme humility was awful grace, and her best charm a bashfulness of face. Matilda died in the 18th year of her marriage, and about the 41st of her age. Her favourite residence was the royal palace of the Saxon kings at Westminster, where, with occasional visits to New Windsor, Winchester, and Woodstock, and other places in which the king her husband thought proper to hold his courts, she passed the greater portion of her wedded life. Many curious remains still exist in the old palace in Westminster, where Matilda kept state as queen and ended her life. This venerable abode of our early sovereigns was originally built by Canute, and, being devastated by fire, was rebuilt by Edward the Confessor, with such enduring solidity, that the antiquaries still point out different portions, which were indubitably the work of the royal Saxon, and therefore must have formed part of the residence of his great niece. Part of the old palace of Westminster is still to be seen, in the buildings near Cotton Garden, and the lancet-shaped windows about Old Palace Yard are declared to appertain to it. Cotton Garden was the private garden of the ancient palace, and therefore belonged especially to Queen Matilda. It would be idle to dwell on Westminster Hall and Westminster Abbey, though the original sites of both were included in the precincts of this palace, because one was rebuilt from the ground by Richard II, and the other by Henry III. Great devastation was made in the royal abode of the Anglo-Saxon queen, by the late disastrous conflagration of the House of Lords and its adjacent apartments, which all belonged to it. The House of Lords was an antique oblong room. It was the hall of state of Matilda's palace. It was called the White Hall, but without any reference to the vast palace of Whitehall, to which the seat of English royalty was transferred in the reign of Henry VIII. As the Painted Chamber, still entire, is well known to have been the bedchamber of Edward the Confessor, and the apartment in which he expired, there can be no doubt that it was the state bedchamber of his niece. A curious room in Cotton House was the private oratory of the Confessor, and was assuredly used by Matilda for the same purpose. While at the south end of the court of requests are to be seen two mighty Saxon arches, the zigzag work of which indicates that its architecture is the most ancient in our country. This was once the deserted state chamber of the royal Saxon palace, but it has been used lately by the House of Commons. There is a statue of Matilda in Rochester Cathedral, which forms the pilaster to the west door. That of King Henry, her husband, forms another. The hair of the queen depends over either shoulder, in two long plaits, below the knees. Her garments are long and flowing, and she holds an open scroll of parchment in her hand. King Henry proved the sincerity of his regard for Matilda by confirming all her charters after her death. Madox, in his History of the Exchequer, quotes one of the monarch's charters, reciting that he had confirmed to the Priory of the Holy Trinity in London the grant of his queen Matilda, for the good of her soul, of £25 on the farm of the city of Exeter, and commands his chief justiciar and the barons of his exchequer to constrain the sheriff of Devonshire to pay the same to the said canons. Matilda's household was chiefly composed of Saxon ladies, if we may trust the evidence of Christian names. The maids of honour were Emma, Gunilda, and Christina, pious ladies, and full of alms deeds, like their royal mistress. After the death of the queen, these ladies retired to the hermitage of Kilburn, near London, where there was a holy well, or medicinal spring. This was changed into a priory in 1128, as the deed says, for the reception of these three virgins of God, sacred damsels who had belonged to the chamber of Matilda, the good queen consort to Henry I. History only particularizes two surviving children of Matilda of Scotland and Henry I. But Gervase, the monk of Canterbury, says she had, besides William and the Empress Matilda, a son named Richard. Hector Boethius mentions a daughter of hers, named Euphemia. The Saxon Chronicle and Robert of Gloucester both speak of her second son Richard. Piers of Langtoft says, the two princes, her sons, were both in Normandy when Matilda died. And Harding says she had two sons, William and Richard. Prince William never returned to England after the death of his royal mother. During the remainder of the year 1118, he was fighting by his father's side against the invading force of the King of France and the partisans of his cousin William Clito. On one occasion, when the noble war horse and its rich caparisons, belonging to that gallant but unfortunate prince, having been abandoned during a hasty retreat, were captured, and Henry presented this prize to his darling heir, the noble youth generously sent them back, with a courteous message, to his rival kinsman and namesake. His royal father, King Henry, did not disdain to imitate the magnanimous conduct of his youthful son after the memorable battle in which the standard of France was taken. When the favourite charger of Louis le Gros fell into his hands, he returned it to the French monarch the next day. The King of France, as suzerain of Normandy, at the general pacification, required of Henry the customary homage for his fief. This the victorious monarch considered derogatory to the dignity of a king of England to perform, and therefore deputed the office to Prince William, who was then invested with the duchy, and received the oath of fealty from the states. The prince solemnly espoused his betrothed bride Alice, the daughter of Fulk, Earl of Anjou, June 1119. King Henry called her Matilda out of respect, it is said, for the memory of his mother, but more probably from a tender regard for his deceased consort, Matilda of Scotland, the love of his youth, and the mother of his children. The marriage was celebrated at Lisieux, in the county of Burgundy, and the prince remained in Normandy with his young bride, attended by all the youthful nobility of England and the duchy, passing the time gaily with feasts and pageants, till the 25th of November, in the year 1120, when King Henry, who had been nearly 2 years absent from his kingdom, conducted Prince William, with his retinue, to Barfleur, for the purpose of embarking for England. The king and his train set sail the same night, leaving the prince to follow in another ship. Fitzstephen, the captain of the Blanche Neuf, the finest vessel in the Norman navy, demanded the honour of conveying the heir of England home, because his father had commanded the Mora, the ship which brought William the Conqueror to the shores of England. His petition was granted, and the prince, with his gay and splendid company, entered the fatal bark with light hearts, and commenced their voyage with mirth and minstrelsy. The prince incautiously ordered 3 casks of wine to be given to the ship's crew, and the sailors were, in consequence, for the most part, intoxicated, when they sailed about the close of day. Prince William, who was desirous of overtaking the rest of the fleet, pressed Fitzstephen to crowd his sails and put out his sweeps. Fitzstephen, having named the White Ship as the swiftest vessel in the world, to make good his boast and oblige his royal passenger, caused his men to stretch with all their might to the oars, and did everything to accelerate the speed of his light bark. While the Blanche Neuf was rushing through the water with the most dangerous velocity, she suddenly struck on a rock called the Cataraise with such impetuosity that she started several planks and began to sink. All was instant horror and confusion. The boat was, however, let down, and the young heir of England, with several of his youthful companions, got into it, and having cleared the ship, might have reached the Norman shore in safety. But the cries of his illegitimate sister, Matilda, Countess of Perche, who distinctly called on him, by name, for succour, occasioning a tender impulse of compassion, he commanded the boat back, to take her in. Unfortunately, the moment it neared the ship, such numbers sprang into it, that it instantly sank with its precious freight, and all on board perished. And of the 300 persons who embarked in the White Ship, but one soul escaped to tell the dismal tale. This person was a poor butcher of Rouen, named Berthold, who climbed to the top of the mast, and was the next morning rescued by some fishermen. Fitzstephen, the master of the luckless White Ship, was a strong mariner, and stoutly supported himself for some hours in the water, till he saw Berthold on the mast, and calling to him, asked if the boat with the heir of England had escaped. But when the butcher, who had witnessed the whole catastrophe, replied, that all were drowned and dead, the strong man's force failed him. He ceased to battle with the waves, and sank to rise no more. The report of this disaster reached England the next day. Theobald of Blois, the king's nephew, was the first who heard it, but he dared not inform his uncle of the calamity which had rendered his house desolate. Besides the heir apparent of England, Prince William, the Saxon chronicler says, there was another son of Henry and Matilda, named Richard, and also Richard, a natural son of the king. Matilda, his natural daughter, Countess of Perche. Richard Earl of Chester, his cousin, with his bride, the young lady Lucy of Blois, daughter of Henry's sister Adela, and the flower of the juvenile nobility, who are mentioned by the Saxon Chronicle as a multitude of incomparable folk. King Henry had reached England with his fleet in safety, and for 3 days was permitted to remain in state of the most agonizing suspense and uncertainty respecting the fate of his children. No one choosing to become the bearer of such evil tidings, at length Theobald de Blois, finding it could no longer be concealed, instructed a favourite little page to communicate the mournful news to the bereaved father, and the child, entering the royal presence with a sorrowful step, knelt down at Henry's feet, and told him that the prince and all on board the White Ship were lost. The great Henry was so thunderstruck with this dreadful news, that he staggered and sank upon the floor in a deep swoon, in which state he remained for many hours. When he recovered, he broke into the bitterest lamentations, magnifying at the same time the great qualities of his heir and the loss he had sustained, and the chroniclers all agree that he was never again seen to smile. It is Henry of Huntingdon who exults so uncharitably over the catastrophe of the White Ship in the following burst of poetic eloquence. The proud youth, he thought of his future reign, when he said he would yoke the Saxons like oxen, but God said, "It shall not be, thou impious one, it shall not be." And so it has come to pass, that brow has worn no crown of gold, but has been dashed against the rocks of the ocean. It was God himself who would not that son of the Norman should again see England. Brompton also speaks unfavourably of this unfortunate young prince. But it should be remembered that England was a divided nation at that period, and that the Saxon chroniclers wrote in the very gall of bitterness against those whom the Norman historians commended. Implicit credence is not to be given to the assertions of either. It is only by reading both, and carefully weighing and collating facts, that the truth is to be elicited. In the last act of his life, William Atheling manifested a spirit so noble, so tenderly compassionate, and forgetful of selfish considerations, that we can only say it was worthy of the son of Matilda, the good queen. The young wife of Prince William was left a widow at the early age of 12 years. She was not among the devoted company who sailed in the White Ship. Henry I was much attached to her, but she returned to her father, the Earl of Anjou, and remaining constant to the memory of her princely consort, she was veiled a nun at Fonteraude. The body of Prince William was never found. Queen Matilda's only surviving child, the Empress Matilda, thus became King Henry's heiress presumptive. She was the first female who claimed the royal office in England. The events of her life are so closely interwoven with those of the two succeeding queens, Adelicia and Matilda of Boulogne, her contemporaries, that to avoid the tedium of repetition, and also to preserve the chronological stream of history in unbroken unity, which is an important object, we must refer our readers to the lives and times of those queens, for the personal history of this princess, from whom her present majesty Queen Victoria derives her title to the crown of England. End of section 10.